What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. Today, we are taking an old eBay Stompa and giving it a massive overhaul. A couple of months ago, I decided to buy an absolutely insane model off of eBay. It had all the hallmarks that make purchasing a used model that, personally, I find absolutely compelling and fun. But most people tend not to want to take on as a hobby project. I put in a ton of work to make this Warhammer Stompa something I really enjoyed and a model I would be more than happy with putting into my own personal orc army. And yeah, in the end, I got there and I was very happy. What I didn't anticipate was the reaction of more than a few people who watched that video. You actually wanted to see those guns. So here we are. And as I did state in one of the earliest comments expressing this opinion, I would absolutely love to build upon this idea and make a proper Stompa with as many guns sticking out of it as I possibly could. But doing so would be a pretty massive undertaking. Not one that I was going to commit to at the time, but would definitely consider in the future. Well, the future is now, and I just happened to pick up another eBay Stompa in desperate need of attention. The plan is simple. Modify this thing to fit as many cool looking guns on it and build the biggest, baddest Stompa anyone has ever seen. Let's take a look at the model we will be working with today. As you can see, it's not quite the beast that the last one was and does actually have most of the parts included. No missing panels this time. The paint is actually not the worst at first glance. The varying colors for the panels are pretty nice. Where we run into issues is how much paint was applied to the model. It's thick, and especially up close you can really see the layers of paint on each panel. On top of that, it's kinda dirty, like it's been sitting on a shelf for quite a few years. So in order to prep the model, I will need to disassemble it and strip off all of the old paint. That will get us down to the plastic and clean off all the dirt and hair that's currently covering it. Now, taking the model apart wasn't too bad. I did use some CA glue deactivator to loosen up some of the thicker joints, and that made it pretty easy to pull apart all of the larger pieces. After everything was taken apart, I got out my trusty ultrasonic jewelry cleaner and started to give each piece a bath. Some of the pieces are pretty large by themselves, so I had to let one half run and then flip it around in order to get full coverage. But because the sonic cleaner is so efficient at getting up old paint, I was able to run each half for about 15 minutes before using a toothbrush to really get in there and scrub away that old paint. After the pieces were cleaned up and dried, I came in with my X-Acto blade and scraped away any mold lines left on the model. The mold lines weren't too bad, but there were a ton of plastic burrs still left from clipping the pieces off of the sprue, something you definitely want to make sure to get before committing paint to a model. But for putting this back together, I'm going to need this to be as clean as I can get so that the plastic will actually stick together. Once all the cleaning was taken care of, it was time to assemble the model. Luckily, everything went together as intended, although the build of this particular model does leave something to be desired, even new out of the box. It's not a great kit. The back panel is a good starting place, and the first two side panels slot into that and the base. Then the neck joint slots into the top of each panel, creating a nice structure that doesn't need a ton of support on the inside. It's just a little fiddly to kind of get those pieces together and glue it at the same time. So CA activator was used to make that glue stick and dry almost instantly. Then there's the first major decision for the model in order to have it be an open chest for all of the guns. I angled the panels out like doors and got them to hang from the connection points that they're supposed to butt up against normally. This did present a few issues though. The panels are supposed to lay flat and fit together at the edges, but having them open means that the tops of each panel are exposed. They don't quite look right, and in order to fix this problem, I decided to use individual orc-style metal panels to cover a ton of the joints and give the model some extra character. Since we are talking about the panels, let's take a step backwards and explore a larger problem for this project. Where am I going to get all the guns to attach to this Stompa? In late December, when I started working on this project, I reached out to a modeling company called Gear Guts Mek Shop. I've seen their designs and minis all over the internet and thought they could really help make this idea come to life. So I emailed them and explained what I was after. I wanted to take this model and give it the most Dakka of any Stompa ever made. Like, not a few guns, but all the guns. The main issue I was dealing with was how to source so many at the size that I actually needed. And on their website, the ones that I really wanted were being sold with the full kits that they had created. I needed them to be broken out of the model and able to print on their own. Luckily, they responded and gave me a curated list of STL files that they sell that would likely fit my project, including the larger pieces I was after. They just happened to be working on this exact problem, and only a few days after I talked to them, the larger gun and weapon options were available individually for print. I ended up buying almost $100 in files for this project. I got all the guns and extra bits that they had for all their larger size mechs, as well as a bunch of orky pipes, spears, and most importantly, single square armor panels. Those armor panels would be the perfect pieces to cover up weird joints and give me a much more scrappy look for this Stompa. Of course, all that means that the 3D printers need to come out, and I need to really start getting ahead of the print times in order to finish this project in a somewhat timely manner. Using an Elegoo Saturn and an Anycubic Mono X, I was able to keep printing going almost constantly for about a week. I printed out an absolute ton of files from Gear Guts. Larger scale guns to fill out the center section, smaller ones that could fill in spaces, and even some really sweet ship cannon style ports that could be attached to the sides of the model. There were even a few full crew cannon batteries that came with a crew of goblins that I plan on using all over this Stompa, much like I did with the orcs in the last one. I also printed a ton of these really cool spears that I thought would make great filler, kind of jam them in between the guns and out the front, as well as give the model a kind of armory feel. Like, if this thing was deployed with a bunch of orcs, then why not grab a stab-a stick off the rack while you're running by? It makes sense. I also ended up with a ton of cool piping that could be used to cover up joints and integrate some of those pieces into the body of the model. Anything extra that I can put on top and give the model a more cohesive look with all these 3D printed parts. For some context into what it is I'm really after, we need to take a look at a couple of images. The first one is more of an artistic representation. This is Games Workshop artwork of an orc mega Stompa or some such, and while there isn't a ton of detail to look at in this picture, you really get a sense of scale and the massive amount of armaments that this thing actually has. Of course, I'm not building one of those particular models. This is just a Stompa, but the guns on the shoulders and the overall grimdark color scheme is kind of what I'm after. The other picture is, of course, the original inspiration for this entire project, the reason we're actually here right now. This is one of 3 Stompas made by Dave P, who actually reached out to me after that first video. Not only was he kind enough to share a little more of the story behind these projects, but he happens to be the first person to ever reach out and claim a model that I've worked on for this channel, and turned out to have proof that he was indeed the creator of the lime green Monster Stompa. As suspected, those green rolls for the guns were indeed receipt rolls, specifically from Harvey's in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. It was very specific. And the build was, in Dave's words, a make-do sort of situation. He has a massive collection of orcs that included 3 different versions of the lime green Stompas, and he ended up selling everything to Tista Minis up in Canada a while back. And eventually, the last of those Stompas made its way to me. What's really cool though, is that Dave is an excellent artist and sent me some really cool orky designs for even more crazy inspirations. These are fantastic and really sell that bashed together but still works feel of orcs, and I love it. Of course, the old receipt Stompa is a good showing of what is possible for a model like this, a proof of concept in a make-do situation, so to speak. And now that I've been printing out a ton of guns non-stop for the better part of the week, it's time to start putting this thing together and getting that initial vision to the next level. I've gathered my bits and sorted them into trays, so it's easier to grab and glue when I feel the need to make modifications. But we are going to start with getting a little more structural support on the doors and give the body a more custom look with those panels. The squares hold the body to the doors a little bit nicer and it feels a lot more rigid. Next up, we'll be adding a few cannon ports, so I shave off a few bolts and let the print sit flat on the body. I really really like the way that these look, but I think we need to make these cannons a little bit bigger. One of the scaled down gun barrels I have fits perfectly into these cannons, so that will go in to make it look like the cannons are pushed out and ready to fire. I really wanted to get shoulder cannons on this guy, so I ended up using the side turret as a mount for one of the battery guns that I printed out. I popped off the top of the barrel and the gun fits perfectly into that hole. It actually looks really proper on top of that thing too, not super thrown together. The other shoulder ended up being way more complicated. There really isn't any place to just slap a gun on, so I went ahead and looked through my bits to see if there was anything to make a sort of platform. It just happened that I had another spare rhino door in one of my boxes. And if you remember from the other Stompa, I used a rhino door as a walkway from the head to the left arm so that orcs could go back and forth to reload or hang out or whatever they do from up there. We're gonna have to come back to that though. At this point, I wasn't sure how I was gonna solve that problem, so I decided to set out the bits and let them kind of stare at me for a while so I could think about it. In the meantime, let's start stacking guns in this guy's chest. I started by laying down some printed scrap basing on the floor, something for the guns to sit on and start that climb up through the body. I used two larger guns that had flat bases built in to really get a good foundation. Then I used this really cool long flamethrower thing right in between those. Another large gun that I could stack neatly and glue down. Using some scaled down battery guns, I glued two of those down to that flamethrower, one on each side. The goal here is to fill the space with as many guns as I can and keep a little bit of symmetry. I feel that will add to the believability that this is supposed to look like this, not purely random and thrown together. Not that thrown together won't completely work, but I want it to look like a plausible part of the model, so some design is needed. After that, I put a few cannons in the gaps on each side and one below. I filled up the rest of the cavity in the same manner, just trying to jam in as much as I could. I filled the space completely to the top, only leaving room so that you could still see the cabling on the top cannon going into the back of the body. At this point, I can't really fit anything else inside of this guy, but there are small enough gaps that I wanted to do something to fill that space. So I opted for that savage orc look and started jamming a ton of spears inside of those gaps. The spears act as another point of contact between the body and the guns, and the glue can really hold on in a bunch of different places. Now this normally wouldn't be an issue, but because the resin guns are really heavy, even hollowed out, they really need that extra support. The chest cavity is pretty much full at this point, so I'm gonna go back to that secondary gun battery on the shoulder and plan on making that make sense. The main problem I'm running into with this area is that there isn't quite enough room to place a full-sized gun in there and make it look like it's supposed to be there. I don't really want anything on this model that is purely slapped on. It needs to fit into the model well enough in order to be plausible. So in order to get a full-size gun battery to fit properly, I need to create a platform that will support the whole thing, not just a gun barrel. The rhino door is definitely a perfect base for this. The size is perfect to go between the arm cannons and the body and sits relatively level. Still, it's not quite the right length to put this gun on top of without it looking a little weird. So there needs to be another piece of the platform to give it more structure. And since we're using tank bits, I figured using another piece of outer tank armor would make the most sense to create a longer platform. So I cut down a part of a panel and glued it down to the front of the rhino door. This gave that space just enough room to fit the base of a battery down and the gun on top. It looks just about perfect too, just sitting up there in its own little nest waiting for a crew to run this extra gun. It's pretty satisfying. Alright, so part of the mission I had when undertaking this project was to pay homage to the original idea, and I think we've mostly accomplished that so far. There are still some other factors, but lots of guns and over-the-top construction is getting there. The other part was to incorporate one of those receipt rolls into the build somehow. One of the bits I attached to the arm of the Stompa has a little hook on it. My thinking is that this hook can be used to salvage anything from the ground and be used to bring up pieces like those rhino bits and guns to sit on top of the Stompa. So I cut a little cross section of the receipt roll and glued it onto the end of the hook. That way there was a little piece of that original inspiration and a neat little story hanging off the side of the model. I think it's just enough for someone to ask, and it's a nice little Easter egg that still looks really cool as part of the model. The very last thing that needs to be done before we actually get to priming this mini is adding a few more armor panels, pipes, and spears. And of course, a ton of chain to hold those guns together. The shoulder cannons specifically, while looking like they will sit there alright, still need to be held down to the body of the Stompa. Like, how would an orc attach this gun so it won't fall off while the whole thing's moving? So I decided on some chain that would wrap around each piece to really make sure that the pieces look like they've just been salvaged and attached to the mech. Chain is one of my favorite ways to add details to a mini. As long as the chain you get has similar chain lengths to the ones shown on the model in the same range, you can really get away with adding it all over the place. So I wrapped the guns around the shoulders and added chains across the panels on the back as well as the open doors. This little bit of extra just really enhances the look of the mini and quite literally holds the whole thing together. I mean, it's not like it would fall apart if it wasn't there. But the chain is bringing all of the most random bits together as one cohesive piece of kit. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention the top door and the chest opening. Normally, there's a really large scrap skull that is part of the Stompa. So I got the thing rigged up as a third door that swings up to reveal the opening for all of the guns. On top of that, I was able to place the saw blade arm underneath that door so it looks like the Stompa is kind of holding it up. Now, the whole front has a lot more believability to it because the model is directly interacting with its fake function. That's really important because more often than not when you convert a model, it can look kind of random. But if the model is in the proper pose to take advantage of the conversion or is interacting with it in some way, it adds a greater level of believability to the scene. Think of it like this. If you take a still photo of this model on the battlefield, does it look like it belongs there? Are the model's actions appropriate for what's going on around it, or is it doing something that it should do? Now, this model has even more of that going on, and it helps to keep things looking like they were meant to be that way in the first place. So that was a ton of work, and now it's time to get this thing prepped for paint. The first step I'm taking here is to add some texture to the model. A little dirt and grime pre-layer will sit underneath the paint and help some of the weird converted bits stick together a little bit nicer. I like using texture like this to not just hide seam lines, but to help unify the look a little bit better. And since I did this with my other Stompa, I want that same kind of feel for both of them. They're pretty much going to be a set from now on, so keeping with the same theme for the army is pretty important for me. Once that layer dries, I'm going to hit the whole thing with a nice layer of black primer and get ready for some color. I decided to go red for this one since that is the color that is featured in the piece of art that I'm using as a reference, and because it's the spot color choice I used on my mostly yellow Stompa. So doing the opposite will look pretty nice when they're both on the table. I'll start by shooting white ink through the airbrush onto all the panels, as well as give any of the little goblins on the model a quick zenithal highlight. Doing this picks out all of the details, and I can set up the panels for some transparent layers of color to take on that gradient. Normally, I would go with a transparent ink as a first layer, but I've been playing around with the new Army Painter air paints quite a bit lately, and they're actually really nice. Using the red triad that's featured on the box for the air paints, I start with the base layer red. Through the airbrush, we get quite a bit of control over opacity, so it wasn't too hard to lay down a thin coat to act quite a bit like ink. After moving up to the mid-tone, that effect does go away, of course, because I'm adding a lot more paint over the top of that and it's just becoming more opaque. But now that the highlight is in the same place as the white ink, that doesn't really matter anymore. So the red goes down, followed by the brighter mid-tone, and is completed with a nice fiery orange red for the highlight. The colors are really vibrant, and I didn't have to mix anything down to get these to shoot out of my airbrush really easily. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now that the main portions of the armor are done, I'm going to use some Vallejo metal color to do pretty much all of the metallics. A lot of the panels are large enough that you can really get in there with an airbrush and not really have to worry about overspray. And on the weapons, I got all of the areas that were easily accessible, and I'll just take care of the rest with a brush. To bring in a little more separation to all of the panels and kind of pre-weather the metallics, I used some burnt umber ink through the airbrush. I took my time outlining the panels and bringing in that dirty color to the metals. And of course, I made sure to hit all the nuts and bolts to really bring out those details. Now on to my favorite part for a model like this, weathering everything down and really bringing out the character of the model. I mix up two different washes to start. A black oil wash that will be mostly used for the metals, and a really nice verdigris to bring in that contrasting color to the panels and guns. Of course, this is all pretty unrealistic, but for something like this, I feel like taking liberties and making something look cool and fun is generally just acceptable. Who knows what this is made of, and if everything is scrap metal that got welded together, well, we can go all sorts of different directions for color choices when it comes to weathering. And honestly, that's what makes it my favorite part. I get to decide where something is taking some damage, or where the model might be falling apart under that fresh coat of paint. And once we get into rust and paint chipping, you can take those micro stories and really expand on them. So whenever you get to weather something, savor that process, because you can really do a lot with just a few different colors and some imagination. When all the oil's dry, I come back in with some bright silver and start to chip up the edges of each of the armor panels. When all of the panels have a little bit of chipping, it really separates everything and helps you see what's going on, like framing 1,000 tiny little pictures, as well as highlight the metallic parts. Lastly, I use some dirty down rust to just kind of spruce up some of the bits on the bottom and really cover a lot of these areas with just more grime. I had a few ideas on how I wanted to make these guns stand out a little bit more. I do actually like the grimy metal quite a bit, but having a nice colored glow out of the front of each end would also look pretty awesome. And it's an opportunity to bring in more character and color to the model. Starting with a white airbrush layer for maximum color brightness, I filled in the ends of each gun barrel. I decided to go with a bright green to continue the nods to that lime green Stompa that started this whole journey. And in looking at that piece of art again, there are little highlights of green coming off of a few of the guns. All in all, it's a nice contrast to the red and make the guns look pretty cool. One of the last things I want to do in the body of this model is bring in that yellow. So we have a mostly red Stompa with a little yellow, which contrasts the mostly yellow Stompa with a little red. These panels are all quite large, so it's easy enough to bring in that white ink and fill in the panels that I think would look nice in yellow. To get that smooth transition for the yellow shadow, I used some muted pink ink from Liquitex to go around each of the edges, the nuts and bolts, and throw in a little shading toward the bottom of each panel. Following that up with a transparent yellow ink, it turns that muted pink into a really deep orangey brown and immediately makes these panels stand out. It's a really cool look and finally takes this Stompa from mostly average to something I really want to take time to look at. Every panel has something different going on, and there are a ton of little details all over this model. So it feels pretty good now that this color is on the model. Now this thing is looking proper dirty and still pretty bright, which is pretty cool. Now that the model is just about complete, there are still some crew members that need some paint. Let's talk about this project while I just finish these last few details. This was a massive undertaking. The idea was there and a great concept was given by Dave with that original model. But with an idea like this comes some pretty large hurdles to overcome, which is why I initially didn't pursue this project on that original Stompa that I bought. This took almost a full month to make, gathering parts for 3D printing, getting those things printed properly, plus assembly and painting. It all took a very long time, and I think that's something that gets lost in the edit of a video like this. On top of that, the cost was pretty out there compared to most of the things that I undertake on this channel. All said and done, with resin, STL files, extra bits, paint, superglue, and the actual model, the total cost of this project was around $300. All that being said, this thing turned out so cool. Like, it's really cool to see on the table. It's a monster unlike any other, and it definitely feels like a centerpiece that comes with a really good story. I want to give a massive thank you to Dave for sharing his lime green monstrosities with the world, and Tista Minis for selling me that first model. And of course, Gear Guts Mek Workshop for helping me gather the proper files to really bring this thing to life. And this brings up something that I find really compelling about our hobby. Everyone has something to say, and when a few people can come together to make something happen, it can really make something special. So often, we find ourselves isolated at our hobby desk, but reaching out to other people, asking for feedback and help with our projects can elevate just about every aspect of the hobby and bring us all closer together as a community. And honestly, I don't think that can be said for most hobbies. I am grateful for all the hobby friends I've made along this journey, and thank each and every one of you for being an integral part of it. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out this channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here is the second time final giant Stompa. Thanks again.